to introduce Andrew Komarnyckyj, the author of the book Ezra Slefas, the next Nobel laureate in literature. My name is Monika Gimbutaitė, and I was probably invited to conduct this interview because I was sort of, in a way, responsible for it being published in Lithuania. This spring, it was published by publishing house Lapas and translated to Lithuanian by Daina Valentinavičienė. So today with Andrew, we are going to talk about the journey that led to this book and its translation, about writing, publishing, criticism. But before we begin, a quick note to the audience. You will also have a chance to ask your questions at the end of our conversation, so take advantage of that opportunity. Andrew, welcome. So great to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and can I just say a couple of words to the audience? Look, thank you for attending. It's an absolute honour and a privilege to be here with you. I'm just delighted to come. I can't tell you how overwhelmed I am.
Wonderful. This is not our first interview. I'm not going to pretend that it is. And during the first one, you mentioned your very first novel that you wrote when you were around 17, and you didn't really like it. Actually, you hated it so much that you decided to quit writing and pursue another path. Do you remember what was that book about?
Yes, I very much do remember. It was a crime novel, but it was not a serious crime novel. It was meant to be funny, and it was called The Mountains of Frankovia. Now, I made a little private joke about the mountains of Frankovia in my novel Ezra Slefas, which nobody but me would ever guess, because one of the books referred to in Ezra Slefas is called The Mountains of Frankovia, and it's really bad. But this Mountains of Frankovia, it involved a bumbling detective who didn't know what he was doing. And when I first wrote it, I thought, hey, this is pretty good. I've done all right here. But you're always advised when you write a novel to put it to one side and look at it again in a few months' time when you've got over yourself, because then you might have a more realistic view of what it's like. So I did exactly that, and I have to say, when I looked at it a few months after writing it, I could tell that this novel was an absolute stinker. I had no illusions about myself as a writer when I read that. So I thought, obviously, I don't have talent. I'm not ever going to be a writer. I might as well forget this and pursue a different career. Now, what I would say in that connection is that what I didn't realize at the time is that writing is a bit like playing a musical instrument or playing a sport, say tennis. Practice makes perfect, and perfect practice makes perfect. And that's what you've got to do. I'd expected that you could just, on the back of nothing, write a novel and it would be good. But later on in later life, I discovered that most people who are successful writers, they've written at least one novel, which is a stinker like mine was, or maybe even several stinkers before they've finally written the good one, which made the grade and made their name. But that was a discovery I wasn't to make for several decades, while I languished doing things other than writing, when I could have been improving my writing. So maybe there's a lesson there for everybody. Don't give up just because you fail. You know the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, try, and try again.
What made you to return to writing? What inspired you, and when did that happen?
Okay, well, I returned to writing in the year 2015. And what inspired me was there was a phenomenon at the time that was sweeping America and sweeping the United Kingdom. It might have started around about 2010, I'm not sure, but you might have heard of things called zombies and films about, you might have come across movies about zombies, horror films and so on. And there seemed to be a plague, if not of actual zombies, a plague of books about zombies that were sweeping the bookshelves everywhere, every bookshop you went into. And I read one or two, and I thought, well, okay, they've got something to offer, but enough already. I think we've really had a bellyful of zombie books. So I decided to write a novel. I just got this idea, a novel which just made fun and poked fun of the whole phenomenon of zombie books. And I got this idea, and the idea was this: what if there was some kind of plague that swept the world, and it turned people into zombies, but not everybody, just celebrity chefs. And you can imagine that if there was a load of celebrity chefs turned into zombies, before they ate people, which is what zombies do, they would have to first cook them, and they would have to cook them using cordon bleu methods, maybe putting nice sauces on them, blue cheese sauce and so on. So I had to come up with a title for the book. Now, every zombie book seemed to have the word apocalypse in it somewhere. So I came up with this book title, Celebrity Chef Zombie Apocalypse. And then I wrote a book all about zombie chefs. And having learned from my earlier experience, I thought it was good, but I put it to one side for a few months and I read it again. Now, it was meant to be a funny book, and I must admit, I have this terrible indulgence. I laugh at my own jokes. So when I read this book the second time round, a few months later, I found I was still laughing at the jokes I'd been laughing at the first time round. So I thought, hey, maybe this can go somewhere. And I sent it off to a publisher, and they went with it. And since then, as the saying goes, I've never looked forward.
So you used to work at various jobs in different fields, and then you started writing, not exactly at the beginning of your career. Was that transition difficult? And did you find it challenging to feel as a part of a literature community when coming from another field?
All right, well, that is a very good question. I think I'd like to answer the second part first. Really, I've never felt like part of the literary community. I've always felt like a bit of an imposter. You might have heard of imposter syndrome. I wonder if you use that phrase in Lithuania. Well, I would go further. I'd say I don't have imposter syndrome. I am an imposter. But okay, I might be an imposter, but I can pass myself off rather well. Let me put it this way, I'm a one-trick pony, but I do it rather well. Anyway, coming back to the first part of the question, did I find the transition difficult? Well, the answer is not really, because it transpired that all of my earlier career, quite by accident, prepared me for the act of writing. And I'd like to go into that a little bit, if I may. You see, the classical career trajectory of writers in the past, if you look at them, is that they've always done a lot of different things first. George Orwell famously talked about having worked as a plongeur in Paris. Now, I didn't go to Paris to work in a kitchen, but I have worked in a kitchen washing dishes, one of the lowliest jobs you can do. And that experience was good for me. It's good for everybody to experience hard, unpleasant work, to be honest. It kind of teaches you something about the horrible ways of this world, and it gives you insight into the way that life works. And that sort of prepared me for being a writer, along with a number of the other hopeless, dead-end jobs I did. Am I going too fast for your interpreter, do you think? Or is this okay? I better inquire.
I can see that. It's good.
All right.
Let's move on.
Great. Moving along swiftly now. So, what happened was, look, let me tell you about my failures. Everybody has failures in their life. I went to study architecture at the age of 18 in Canterbury, at what was then Canterbury School of Art. And I was very, very lazy. And that didn't help me because architecture requires a lot of hard work. And then there was another problem with studying architecture. It was that I met a young man called Larry Tye, and he introduced me to his favourite hobby. His favourite hobby was drinking. And I very quickly made that my favourite hobby. And we did a lot of drinking together. And at the end of 3 years, I left Canterbury College of Art without a degree. Well, I could have got a degree in drinking if they'd offered one, but that wasn't on the curriculum for some reason. So then I had to somehow make a living with an education that wasn't as complete as it might have been. And that's why I spent several years in dead-end jobs doing boring manual work that nobody in their right mind would choose to do. Obviously, some people in this world, sadly, they have no choice in the matter. Then what happened was, I met the lady who subsequently became my wife. She's called Me Too. And as our relationship developed, and I realized there was a good chance we were going to be together forever, I thought, well, I just can't go on doing these dead-end jobs. I need to have a career. So I started training to be a lawyer, and I had to completely change the way I was. I had to go from being lazy and directionless to being hard-working and as focused as a laser, because I was working full-time in rubbish jobs, and I was studying law part-time, going to night school, doing correspondence courses, and probably in Lithuania, it's the same as it is in England. The law requires an awful lot of study. Anyway, long story short, I did qualify to be a lawyer. I actually became what in the United Kingdom is called a solicitor, and I practiced in law for a number of decades. Now I'm going to explain why that was very, very useful for me. When you practice law, you can't bullshit people. Hopefully your interpreter can make sense of that. You cannot bluff your way to knowledge that you do not have. And if you put forward an argument and there is a single hole in that argument, someone is going to demolish it very, very quickly indeed. So to study law and practice law, it calls for very logical thinking, and you can't use a big word when a little one will do, because everything you say must make sense. And then the other thing about being a lawyer, which helped, is when you practice law, you don't get to put your feet up. I know you can see films where the lawyer seems to have just one case and he can devote all his time to that case, or she can. But in point of fact, it's very common for a lawyer to have 100 cases or even 200 cases going on at the same time, and it's like juggling plates. Do you know what I mean by that? Juggling plates, these old acts that you used to see, or juggling balls for that matter. You have to see to all these cases at once, and that means being able to read things quickly, understand things quickly, and respond quickly in writing. Now that prepared me ever so well. In the early part of my legal career, I had a secretary to do all my typing for me. Later on in my career, I did all the typing myself. So now, I should say then, back in 2015, when I went back to being a writer, I could type quickly. I had the sort of work ethic to be able to produce 2,000 words a day, for the sake of argument, very easily. And I could think logically and clearly, and I really think that that is an essential to writing a novel. So I was equipped with all the tools, plus life experience. Now that's something that you just cannot substitute with anything else. I really do believe in that old virtue of life experience when you're a writer. That doesn't mean to say that you're going to write about your life, but what it does mean is when you're imagining things, you use the experiences you've had to inform your writing, how to write about joy and sadness and pain and pleasure and all the rest of it. I hope that answers your question, Monika.
Absolutely. So before moving on and discussing Ezra Slefas a bit deeper, for those who still haven't read the book, how would you describe it?
Okay, right, let me see. Well, first and foremost, it's a funny book. Now, I was told earlier today that you don't have many funny books in Lithuania, and that generally speaking, your literature tends to be serious. So it's quite unusual. Well, I'm delighted to have presented you with something a bit different to your ordinary experiences. Now, I hope you don't mind if I embark on a little literary theory, okay? But I promise you, I'll try not to make it too heavy and boring. So there's something that you have probably heard of, a movement in literature called modernism. And what modernism involved was, if I could summarize it roughly this way, there is no one set definition of modernism, but rather modernism is born of a number of attitudes. The modernists, who might have included people like, say, James Joyce, perhaps, I think he's classed as a modernist. These writers and artists, because there were many painters among them, and philosophers come to that, they believed in the idea that of progress. They were determined to break with the past. Their view was that they could make art and write novels that were objectively better than what had been done in the past, that they could improve things. And so they explored new ways of painting, as with the Cubists, and new ways of writing, as with James Joyce. Although I think at least some of what he did had been done before, but still, that's beside the point, as it were. So that was the modernists. They were all about optimism, belief in science, progress in society, break with the past. Then along came people called the postmodernists, and this is where Ezra Slefas comes in. Now, the postmodernists, I think their thinking might have been conditioned by the two world wars, the First World War and the Second World War. So they believed, well, actually, maybe there isn't such a thing as this progress. Maybe we can't trust science. We can't trust power structures. Maybe the modernists believed there was such a thing as objective truth. Well, we don't believe that. We believe that the individual is the person who has the truth, and truth is entirely subjective. Anyway, the postmodernist developed all kinds of theories of literary criticism. For instance, structuralism and deconstructionism. But frankly, they went a bit far with all this theory, and when you read it closely, a lot of it does not make any sense. A lot of these literary critics, honest to God, hand on heart, they talk sheer nonsense. And they're very pretentious. Now, I think the reason for this is they claimed to be very skeptical about power structures, and they worked in universities, and guess what? They were interested in building their own power structures and enhancing their own status as university lecturers and professors. And the way they did that was by coming up with a language that nobody could understand. So what I did in Ezra Slefas was I looked at this approach to literary criticism and I made fun of it. I made a joke of it. So that's one of the things I did with Ezra Slefas. But there was another thing I did too, which was the postmodernists, they sort of came out against the traditional novel. So I structured Ezra Slefas as a very traditional novel indeed. In some ways, it's a retelling of the Faust story about a man who makes a pact with the devil. That's what it's about, and he gets his comeuppance. So it works out badly for him, his pact with the devil, let me put it that way. So you've got this traditional story, very traditional story about a pact with the devil, but at the same time, the book is packed with information about the postmodernist approach to literary criticism in order to poke fun at it. So it's a contradictory book in a way. It's a very traditional book, but it has these very postmodern trappings. You could say it wears the clothing of postmodernism. Now, I'm going to inflict something on you. I hope you don't mind, but it's all in a good cause. I've told you that much of what these postmodern literary critics said was nonsense and that it doesn't make sense. So I'd like to give you an example, just in case some of you might not have quite believed me. Now, there was a man called Jacques Derrida, a French intellectual, and he came up with this approach to literary criticism called deconstruction. And he used his methods on a number of authors, Franz Kafka, James Joyce, Mallarmé, to name but three. But he never wrote about Samuel Beckett. He delivered some lectures about Samuel Beckett, but he never wrote about Samuel Beckett. And he was asked why. Why did you not write about Samuel Beckett? And I've got his answer here. I apologize in advance to your interpreter. She is going to struggle massively with this. She's just going to have to do her best. It's mercifully short, okay? So this is Jacques Derrida explaining why he never wrote about Samuel Beckett. The composition, the rhetoric, the construction and rhythm of his works, even the ones that seem most decomposed, that's what remains, finally, the most interesting. That's the work, that's the signature, this remainder, which remains when the thematics is exhausted, and also exhausted by others for a long time now, in other modes. That is what for some people passes as legitimate literary criticism in our universities.
Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on Ezra Slefas now.
Yeah.
It is supposed to be a book on this great postmodernist,
Yeah,
Ezra
yeah.
Slefas. It's supposed to be his biography, but we soon realized that it is much more about Humbert Botkin,
Yeah.
who is a professor who actually writes that biography. So a question that arises naturally, seeing that you are making fun of both of them in almost every single page of your book, is who do you dislike more, the Botkins of literature world or the Slefas?
Oh dear, that is such a hard question to answer. I mean, let me see. Well, let's start with the Botkins, the professors. An awful lot to answer for, because of the way that they have polluted the minds of lots of young people. And they should be seeking to bring out the best in those people, but they're not. They're sending them on a false path. So there's a massive dark stain on all those professors who do that. Now, as for the Slefas, well, you know, let's face it, a lot of them are fraudulent and they're making money on a false prospectus. So we can, do you know what I mean by Room 101? Room 101 in 1984, where you get penalised for doing something wrong. Well, I'm going to send the Botkins of this world to Room 101. And then very shortly afterwards, I'm going to send the Slefas of this world to Room 101. They both deserve to be there, in short order. Sorry, I can't choose. Look, if you ask me to choose between who I dislike most, between the Slefas and the Botkins, or ask me to choose anything between the two, this is my answer.
So there's this character in your book called Bogus Dog. He is on Twitter and he barks on all things bogus. That's why Botkin's tweets receive a lot of barks.
Yeah.
Let's discuss other possible targets for bogus dogs. What tendencies do you find to be bogus in today's literary world? Or if you'd like, you could mention a few Twitter accounts as well.
Okay, good question. Well, in the literary world, I think one thing that's very bogus and is really coming to the fore these days is that if you are a celebrity, you've got a book deal. You don't need talent, you've got a book deal. And, I should, you know what, I should have thought about this more and come here with a few names. But I noticed this week in the news, in the United Kingdom, where I come from, there was a woman who's a celebrity who's written a novel and she's got a book deal, it's been published, but then read between the lines and it turns out that it was ghostwritten. She didn't actually write it, it's got her name on it. And she's getting the credit for it. The ghostwriter's not getting any credit for it. So just to be clear, this isn't a memoir, it's a novel. I mean, that is definitely one for bogus dog right there. But I would say further, pretty much any celebrity that gets a book deal just for being a celebrity, please, how is that right? It can't be. Usually, by the way, when that happens, there is a ghostwriter hanging around in the background who hasn't been credited. Now, that said, if someone came along to me and said to me, Andrew, I'd like to give you a large sum of money, 50,000 euros, to ghostwrite my novel, I'd probably think it was rather a good idea.
So there's a lot of work for bogus dog.
Yeah, and so bogus dog can bark at me too.
An interesting aspect in Bodkin's storyline is his almost accidental review, an accidentally published review, in which he completely trashes the book and its author.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you, what would you consider to be good criticism from point of view as a reader and as a writer? Do these definitions differ from different perspectives?
Well, I can answer that in at least 3 different ways. So
Let's try 2, maybe.
yeah, okay, 2. 2's enough. You're right. 3's a crowd. Yeah. Well, as a reader, I would say that I'm quite a kind reviewer. So if I read a book and I don't like it, I don't leave a written review anywhere. Now, I don't encourage other people to follow that policy, okay? And especially with regard to my own books, I prefer it if I get good and bad reviews. You know, the bad ones are talking points. And when I'm telling, you know, we can all be in the company of friends and we'll tell them little stories about ourselves. Well, I always think there's no point in telling people about the things that I've succeeded at in life because, let's face it, that's a bit boring. It's much more interesting to talk about your failures, isn't it? So I welcome bad reviews because they give me good talking points. Now, I would not want a review, a book of mine to get 100% bad reviews. I think maybe 50% is just about the limit that I'd want. More than 50% would be pushing my envelope of tolerance. Okay, but yeah, a few bad reviews amongst the mix, that's great. It's like the spices in the pot making the pot work, because you want a bit of controversy, don't you? So as a writer, yeah, you want a mix of good and bad reviews, mainly good, mainly positive, but a few bad ones. I mean, if you don't make a bit of controversy, what is the point of writing? Come on, we want to stir up feelings. And yeah, we want to stir up good feelings, but we want to stir up a few people in a way that's provoking them too. Writing should be provocative, at least some of the time. Sorry, I seem to have gone on and I'm not sure I've answered your question, but hopefully I've partly answered it.
I think. But I also want to ask you, have you ever received any criticism for not portraying academia or literary world in a correct way?
All right. I'm delighted you've asked that question. So, Ezra Slefas, in case you don't know it, it pokes fun particularly at the world of academia, university professors, pretentious literary criticism, and the rest. That's the kind of book it is. It takes no prisoners, believe me. And mostly the reception has been very favourable, but then mostly the people who've read it have not been high-blown literary critics. But interestingly, one did read it. I hesitate to name names, so please don't quote me on this. But hey, what the hell?
They are recording everything, just saying.
Yeah. So there was one reviewer called Daniel Green. He's an American. And I guess he loves postmodernism. He loves it with a passion. And he doesn't much care for funny books, I found out. So he got a copy of Ezra Slefas, and let's just say that his review wasn't the most positive review I've ever had. Between you and me, don't quote me on this, I suspect he felt just a bit threatened in his professional capacity, or in his capacity as a reviewer, whichever. But it was fun.
And was it fun writing this book?
Oh my goodness, yeah, look, so let me tell you, one of my worst habits, in fact, my wife will probably tell you it's my worst habit. And she should know, she's lived with me a long time now. I laugh at my own jokes, all right? Sorry for that, but I do. I can't help it. And there's a lot of jokes in Ezra Slefas, and as I was writing it, I was chuckling away. It was such good fun. Yeah, hugely entertaining for the writer, and hopefully that comes across to at least some of the readers.
Can you tell a little bit about your search for a publisher in the United Kingdom? Was it difficult to find one?
Well, I suppose it was. I wrote the book. I felt it was a good book. But, you know, when you're a writer, you can fool yourself a little bit. I'm very aware of that pitfall. So you finish a book, you might think it's a good book, but you always have your doubts. And I started off by sending it to literary agents. And I got a load of rejections. So I thought, well, maybe it's not such a good book after all. There were one or two who at least gave me some, what we call in England, warm words. In other words, words of encouragement. And they said, look, you know, we admire the book, but we don't really think it's our kind of book. We don't feel we could advocate for it to a publisher. So after I'd got maybe 20 or 30 rejections, oh, by the way, one of the main, I'm just going to digress for a moment. One of the main qualities that a writer needs is a thick skin. You have to be able to take rejection, because believe me, you're gonna face a lot of rejection. Just a word of warning there for any aspiring and budding writers among you. Right. Back to the main thing. So I found no literary agent would take my book and represent it. And I looked at publishers. And what you have to do when you pitch a book to a publisher is you have to find a publisher that's a good fit for your book. Because, you know, some publishers do literary fiction, some do crime novels, some do horror books and so on. And I came across this publisher called Tartarus Press. They're a small outfit. They're only a 2-person operation. And they have a very interesting way of publishing. They do limited edition hardback books. And they do Kindle books and EPUBs, so I suppose you could say that's an unlimited number of copies, if you wanted to. When people say to me, how many books have you had published? How many copies have you had published? I could answer, it's unlimited, and I'd be right, because they're Kindle books. But anyway, Tartarus Press, I had to find a way of pitching the novel to them, and they do what they call literary strange fiction, which essentially means books that have a supernatural element. And I hadn't really thought of my novel in that way, but it does have a deal with the devil in it. So I sent it off to them with a little pitch about how it's right up their street, it's their kind of book. And blow me if they didn't get back to me within 48 hours and said, we want to publish your book. So since then, what can I say? It's been one thing after another with that book. Yeah, fantastic.
So here comes a question that I've been wanting to ask you for a long time.
Yeah.
How surprised were you to find out that there's a publishing house in Lithuania that wants to publish your book? Because, correct me if I'm wrong,
yeah.
It was the first translation, wasn't it?
It was the first translation, and if I could put it this way, on a scale of 1 to 10, my level of surprise was 399, okay? And yeah, it was such a delight, and I'll tell you why. I sort of felt that that book was maybe, in a way, a very English book with a very English sort of humour. And I thought, well, it's remarkable that what it contains could reach out to someone in another country and they could respond to what it has to offer. Frankly, it's every writer's dream. You want to be able to communicate your ideas to other people, but you never really think it will be able to cross borders and introduce and affect people in other cultures. So that was a surprise and a delight to me that someone from another country might be interested in it. I'm overwhelmed, frankly.
So some context. There were no previous translations, no major awards. The original print run was 300 copies.
Correct, yeah.
We decided to triple that, and I would love to tell you a story that I was so sure of my instincts at the time, so confident in that decision, but of course I wasn't, and I even wrote on Facebook when the book got released that I think it has almost as much chance of winning readers' love as becoming a total flop. So we're sitting here today, so I think it is a success, but that's what I really want to talk with you about the risks we have to take in this business, because it's way easier to write the same books, publish the same books, read the same books, review them in the same way. And of course, there are those who provide us with something new, something unconventional. But I think it happens on a rather small scale. Do you think it's possible to break that cycle on a larger scale in today's market?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very conscious of the fact that publishing houses that have limited resources are in a very difficult position. And it's very tough being a publisher in today's marketplace. There are so many demands on the leisure time of readers. There was a time when the world was more innocent, when there was no internet, there were no video games and so on and so forth, when it was probably easier to publish a novel and make a success of it. But now it's very tough, which is partly why the bigger publishers have retreated to some extent to publishing the work of celebrities, and this would include internet celebrities, vloggers and so on, who have a big platform, a big following, because that's where the money is and they're chasing the money, and you can't blame them for that. It's these days, by and large, the smaller publishing houses like La Paz that are taking the risk, and a big risk it is too. How do we break this cycle? Goodness me, that is a question, isn't it? And I don't know what the answer is. I'm very grateful that I've had the modest amount of success I've had with my books that are, frankly, by and large, a bit different to the norm, and long may that continue. I do notice that there are some larger publishing houses that do publish things that are a bit different now and again, so maybe there is hope for us. I read a book a couple of years ago, or was it 1 year ago, called The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Now, that was a very different kind of book, a very unique book with a very odd idea. And for anybody who's come across the book Yellowface, that's been published by a mainstream publisher. Again, it's, I would say, quite an unusual book, which looks at the phenomenon of publishing from a rather ironic perspective. So maybe there's hope. All right, the sky has clouded over. They're very dark clouds, but there are just one or two little rays of sunshine peeping through, provided by the likes of Lepas Publishing, the likes of Tartarus Press, and sometimes even very rarely, I mean so rarely that it's like a hen's tooth, provided by the mainstream publishers. And I wish I could say I've got an answer, but I haven't.
So on that semi-dramatic, semi-hopeful note, do we have any questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah, please, fire away. So what was that, sorry?
If I heard correctly, could you name a few titles of books that you find funny? Is that right? Yeah.
Oh dear, you know what, I should have prepared better for this.
Next time.
Wow. Let me see. I found a book by a gentleman called Andrew Lipstein, quite funny recently. And if I can just scratch my head and remember the title, it was Last Resort. That's right. And another book and that came out fairly recently. I think that was a 2022 publication, Last Resort by Andrew Lipstein. Now, I'm not saying everybody would find it funny. One that maybe I'm on safer ground with, that more people would find funny, is an older book. It's by a writer called Anthony Burgess, many of you will probably have heard of, and it's called Inside Mr. Enderby. That is rather a funny book. Is that enough funny books? I'm not sure.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your book. I had a great pleasure reading it, and thank you for Lepas for publishing it. My question is related to your relationship to postmodernism.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've seen Anne Hall, a movie by Woody Allen. Anne Hall?
I haven't seen Annie Hall. I'm familiar with the film, yeah.
The main character, Albert Singer, says, quotes actually Groucho Marx.
Yeah.
And it's a joke, which sounds a bit like, I probably will butcher it, but it sounds like, I would like to belong to a club which will have a member.
Oh, I know the quote. Yeah, I know the quote.
Don't you think your relationship with postmodernism is something like that? Because in my kind of sense, the Ezra Slefas is a very postmodernist book.
Yeah.
And the way you criticize it is very postmodernist, and you're like doing that imposter job once again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. Yes, because I wouldn't say that I hate postmodernism. What I always say is that I have a love-hate relationship with it. I mean, there are some fantastic aspects to postmodernism and some absolutely horrible aspects to postmodernism. So I like to think I've taken the good bits and I've junked the bad bits, but maybe I'm flattering myself. Maybe I'm being postmodernist in even saying that.
So our time is up. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been great having you here. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
All right, well, thank you, Monika. Just once again, thank you, everybody. It's been an absolute privilege to be here and to have you turn up for this event. Thanks a lot.